The steady beep of medical monitors echoed through the dimly lit hospital room on the third floor of St. Mary's Hospital. Rain tapped gently against the window, creating a melancholic rhythm that matched the somber atmosphere inside. In bed number 307 lay a small figure. A 12-year-old girl named Mai, her delicate frame almost lost among the white sheets and medical equipment surrounding her. For the past 3 months, Mai had been lying there, silent and still, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm maintained by the machines around her. The tragic car accident that brought her here had taken away not just her consciousness, but also the only family she had known, her foster parents. The rain-slicked roads, the screeching tires, and the devastating crash had changed everything in a matter of seconds. Dr. Patel made his way through the quiet corridor, his footsteps echoing off the walls as he approached May's room for his morning rounds. He'd been treating her since the day she was brought in, and something about her case touched him deeply. Maybe it was because she reminded him of his own daughter, or perhaps it was the stack of perfect attendance certificates and academic awards they'd found among her belongings. Evidence of a bright young mind now trapped in silence. "Good morning, May," he said softly, checking her vital signs as he did every morning. It had become a ritual for him, speaking to her as if she could hear every word. The doctors and nurses called it a persistent vegetative state, but Dr. Patel had been in medicine long enough to know that the human brain held mysteries that science was still trying to understand. As he reviewed her charts, a young nurse named Rita walked in, carrying fresh flowers to replace the ones by May's bedside. Rita had taken a special interest in May's case, often spending her break times sitting with the young girl, reading stories, or simply talking about her day. Today, she had brought a book of old folk tales, something she'd picked up from a second-hand bookstore. "The other nurses think I'm silly for spending so much time here," Rita confided to Dr. Patel as she arranged the flowers. "But I've been reading about coma patients who say they could hear everything happening around them. And besides," she added, looking at May's peaceful face, "no one should be alone, especially not a child." Dr. Patel nodded understandingly. He'd seen countless cases over his 20 years of practice, but May's was different. The circumstances of her life before the accident were as mysterious as her current condition. Born to immigrant parents who had vanished without a trace when she was just 4 years old, Mai had bounced between foster homes, carrying with her only a small backpack and an old journal filled with drawings. As Dr. Patel conducted his examination, he noticed something unusual on the EEG monitor. The brainwave patterns showed subtle changes, nothing dramatic, but different from the usual readings. He made a note in her chart, not wanting to raise false hopes, but feeling a slight stirring of optimism. Just then, Rita opened the book she'd brought and began to read softly. The story was about an ancient temple hidden in distant mountains, its secrets protected by time and nature. As her voice filled the quiet room, the EEG monitor showed another small change in May's brain activity. Dr. Patel watched the monitor closely, years of medical experience telling him that something was different today. The rain outside had stopped, and sunlight began to filter through the windows, casting a warm glow across May's face. Neither the doctor nor the nurse knew it yet, but they were about to become part of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the human mind. In the peaceful quiet of room 307, as Rita's voice continued to weave tales of ancient wisdom and hidden temples, May's journey back to consciousness was about to begin in a way that would astonish not just the medical community, but the entire world. Rita hadn't planned on becoming so attached to the young girl in room 307. It started small, just a few extra minutes during her rounds, straightening May's blanket or adjusting her pillows. But soon, those few minutes turned into hours spent during her breaks, talking to the quiet figure in the hospital bed as if they were old friends. Today, like every other day, Rita arrived early for her shift. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the windows, casting long shadows across the hospital floor. She carried her usual bag, filled with books, a hairbrush, and a small bottle of lavender-scented lotion that she used to moisturize May's hands and feet. "Your hair's getting so long," Rita said softly as she gently worked a brush through May's dark strands. "When you wake up, maybe we can try some of those braiding styles I've been practicing." She smiled, remembering how she'd been watching tutorials online, preparing for the day her young patient would open her eyes. Other nurses would sometimes shake their heads when they passed by. "Rita's getting too involved again," they'd whisper. But Rita didn't care. She'd been a nurse for 15 years, and she'd learned to trust her instincts. There was something special about May, something in the way her brain activity would spike when Rita read certain stories, or how her fingers would sometimes twitch when music played in the room. As she worked, Rita thought about the journal they'd found among May's things. It was filled with incredible drawings, detailed sketches of temples and mountains that seemed too precise for a 12-year-old to create. She'd shown them to her brother, an architecture professor, who had been amazed by their complexity. "These aren't just imagination," he had said, studying the drawings. "These are architectural details that even my students struggle with." But how could she know these things? Rita pulled out her favorite book of folk tales, the ones that seemed to get the strongest reactions on the EEG monitor. As she read, she noticed something different about May's breathing. Subtle changes that her years of nursing experience had taught her to recognize. She watched the monitors more closely, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. Through the window, she could see the hospital garden coming to life as the morning progressed. A family of birds had made their nest in a nearby tree, and their chirping provided a cheerful backdrop to her reading. Rita had chosen this particular story today, one about ancient wisdom passed down through generations, about knowledge that sleeps in our bones until we're ready to understand it. As she read, she absent-mindedly stroked May's hand, something she'd done hundreds of times before. But this time, something was different. Was it her imagination, or did May's fingers move slightly in response to her touch? Rita held her breath, watching carefully. There it was again, a definite movement. She quickly pressed the call button, trying to keep her voice calm as she spoke to the nurse's station. Dr. Patel arrived within minutes, his eyes sharp as he checked the monitors and examined May's responses. The EEG readings were definitely showing increased activity. "Talk to her," Dr. Patel encouraged. "Keep reading. There's definitely something happening here." Rita picked up the book again, her voice steady despite her racing heart. As she read about ancient temples and hidden wisdom, the monitors began showing even more activity. May's fingers twitched again, more noticeably this time. For 3 months, Rita had talked to Mai about everything, her own childhood, her dreams, her fears. She'd shared stories about her family, about the patients she'd helped over the years, about the little moments that made life beautiful. She'd done it believing that somewhere, somehow, Mai could hear her. Now, as the morning light filled the room and the birds sang their cheerful songs, Rita watched in wonder as May's eyelids began to flutter. After all these months of silence, something was changing. The quiet girl who had captured her heart was starting to wake up, and Rita had a feeling that what was about to happen would change all their lives forever. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of a story more extraordinary than any tale she'd ever read from her books of folklore and ancient wisdom. The more the hospital staff dug into May's past, the more questions they found. It started when Dr. Patel decided to review her complete medical history, hoping to find something, anything, that might help them understand her condition better. What he discovered instead was a story that seemed more like a mystery novel than a patient's file. In a dusty filing cabinet at Social Services, they found the original report from the night May's parents disappeared. It was a cold February evening, and the family had been having dinner at their small apartment above the restaurant where her parents worked. The neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. The next morning, 4-year-old May was found alone in the apartment, sleeping peacefully in her bed, while her parents had vanished without a trace. The strangest thing, the old social worker told Dr. Patel over the phone, was that nothing in the apartment was disturbed. The dinner dishes were still on the table, half eaten. Their coats were still hanging by the door. Their wallets, phones, and keys were all there. It was like they just disappeared into thin air. Little May couldn't tell them much at the time. She said she'd gone to bed after dinner, and when she woke up, her parents were gone. The police investigation went nowhere. No bank accounts were touched, no suspicious activities were reported. It was as if May's parents had simply ceased to exist. After that, May bounced between foster homes. But here was another mystery. Despite the trauma and constant moving, she excelled in school. Her teachers consistently reported that she was bright, creative, and oddly mature for her age. One teacher noted that during art class, May would draw incredibly detailed pictures of places she'd never been. Rita sat in the hospital break room, carefully turning the pages of May's journal. The drawings inside were remarkable. Page after page showed intricate sketches of what looked like ancient temples, with precise architectural details that seemed impossible for a child to know. There were strange symbols in the margins and what looked like maps of mountain ranges. "Look at this," Rita said to Dr. Patel, pointing to one particular drawing. "My brother says these architectural features are specific to temples built during the Tang dynasty in China. How would Mai know about these? She's never even been to China." Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses, studying the drawing. In his 20 years of medicine, he'd seen many unusual cases, but something about May's story nagged at him. The car accident that brought her here had been thoroughly investigated. A rainy night, a slippery road, a tragic but simple explanation. Yet her coma readings were unlike anything he'd seen before. Just then, a young intern rushed into the break room, slightly out of breath. "Dr. Patel, you need to see this," she said, holding out a tablet. "I was digitalizing May's old school records, and I found something interesting. In her last school, she won a history competition with an essay about ancient Chinese medicine. The teachers were amazed because she included details that weren't in any of the school books." Rita and Dr. Patel shared a look. The pieces were there, but they couldn't quite see the full picture yet. How was it possible that this young girl, born in America to immigrant parents, could know so much about ancient Chinese culture? And what did it have to do with her current condition? As they talked, the sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the hospital windows. In her room, Mai lay quietly, the monitors showing the now familiar pattern of increased activity whenever someone read from the Book of Ancient Tales. Her latest foster parents' personal effects from the accident had finally been released by the police, and among them was an old pendant with unusual markings. Markings that matched some of the symbols in May's journal. The mysteries were piling up, but no one in the hospital could have predicted how they would all come together. As night fell over the city, May's brain activity began to show new patterns, and the biggest revelation was yet to come. One that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the human mind, memory, and the secrets we carry in our very DNA. The morning started like any other at St. Mary's Hospital, but Dr. Patel felt different somehow. Maybe it was the unusual dream he'd had about ancient temples, or perhaps it was the way the morning light seemed to dance differently through the hospital windows. As he walked into May's room for his morning check, he noticed something odd on her EEG monitor. "These patterns," he muttered to himself, leaning closer to the screen. In all his years of medicine, he'd never seen brain activity quite like this. The waves weren't just random spikes anymore. They seemed to follow a rhythm, almost like a pattern or a code. He pulled out his phone and started recording the data. Rita arrived shortly after, carrying her usual bag of books and her morning coffee. She noticed Dr. Patel's intense concentration immediately. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her things. "Something's different, isn't it?" "Watch this," Dr. Patel said quietly. He picked up the book of Chinese mythology that Rita had been reading yesterday and opened it to a random page. As soon as he started reading, the patterns on the EEG monitor changed dramatically. The waves became more organized, more intense. Now watch what happens when I read something else. He pulled out a medical journal from his coat pocket and began reading. The brain activity immediately decreased, returning to its usual pattern. It's like her brain is responding specifically to these ancient stories. Rita sat down beside May's bed, her coffee forgotten. "Try the page about the hidden temple again," she suggested. "That's the one that always seemed to get the strongest reaction." As Dr. Paddle began reading the story, something extraordinary happened. The monitor started beeping faster, and May's fingers began to twitch more noticeably than ever before. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, and for a moment, both Rita and Dr. Patel held their breath. "Keep reading," Rita whispered, holding May's hand. "I think she's trying to tell us something." The story was about an ancient temple hidden high in the mountains of Funan province, said to contain scrolls of forgotten wisdom. As Dr. Paddle read about the temple's secret location, marked by two distinctive peaks that looked like dragon's horns, May's hand squeezed Rita's fingers. "Look at this," Rita exclaimed, pointing to May's journal that lay open on the bedside table. There, drawn with incredible detail, were two mountain peaks that looked exactly like dragon's horns. Below the drawing were symbols that matched the ones on the old pendant found among her foster parents' belongings. Dr. Paddle quickly called in the neurology team. Soon, May's room was filled with doctors and specialists, all watching in amazement as her brain activity continued to show increasingly complex patterns. One of the neurologists, who had studied meditation practices in Tibet, noticed something fascinating. "These patterns," he said, pointing to the EEG display, "they're similar to what we see in deep meditation states. But there's something more here, something I've never seen before." Throughout the day, they continued to monitor May's responses. They tried reading different stories, playing various types of music, showing pictures from her journal. Each time they returned to the story about the hidden temple, her reactions grew stronger. As evening approached, Dr. Patel sat in his office, surrounded by printouts of May's brain scans, her journal drawings spread across his desk. The pendant with its mysterious markings lay next to them, catching the last rays of sunlight through his window. Something was building, he could feel it. In all his years of medicine, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that they were on the verge of something extraordinary. May wasn't just responding to stimuli. She was trying to communicate something specific. Outside his office, the hospital was quieting down for the night shift. The soft beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of medical equipment created a peaceful backdrop. But in room 307, May's brain activity continued its mysterious dance, like a signal trying to break through from another world, carrying a message that would soon change everything they thought they knew about the human mind and its hidden capabilities. The quietness of Sunday morning at St. Mary's Hospital was broken by the gentle sound of Rita's voice as she read from the Book of Ancient Tales. Dr. Patel had just finished his rounds and decided to stop by May's room one last time before heading home. The past few days, unusual readings had kept him at the hospital longer than usual, catching up on paperwork while keeping a close eye on his young patient. The morning sun filtered through the window blinds, creating patterns on May's peaceful face. Rita had just turned to the story about the hidden temple, the one that always seemed to trigger the strongest responses when it happened. May's eyes opened. It wasn't the gradual awakening they'd expected from a coma patient. There was no confusion, no disorientation. Her eyes simply opened, clear and focused, as if she'd just woken up from a regular night's sleep. But what happened next left everyone in the room speechless. "Gu lao di ji shi zai deng dai zu," May said, her voice clear and strong, speaking perfect Mandarin Chinese. Her eyes focused on Dr. Patel with an intensity that made him step back. "The ancient wisdom waits," she continued, now in perfect English, without any trace of confusion or weakness that should have been present after months in a coma. Rita dropped her book, her hands shaking as she reached for the call button. Dr. Patel stood frozen, his medical training temporarily forgotten, as he tried to process what he was witnessing. May sat up in bed, removing the monitoring equipment with careful, deliberate movements. "The temple between the dragon horns," she said, her voice steady. "I know where it is. I know what it contains. They've been waiting for so long." Her words trailed off as she looked around the room, taking in her surroundings with remarkable calmness. The room quickly filled with medical staff, all staring in amazement as May began describing, in perfect detail, a temple hidden high in the mountains of Hunan province. She spoke of ancient manuscripts preserved in sealed chambers, of knowledge passed down through generations, of secrets waiting to be rediscovered. "But how?" Dr. Patel finally managed to ask. "How do you know all this? And the Chinese language, you never spoke it before." May smiled, a smile that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her 12 years. "While I was sleeping," she said, "I remembered. Not just my memories, but theirs too. All of them, going back through time." She reached for her journal on the bedside table, flipping through the pages of detailed drawings. "These aren't just drawings," she explained. "They're memories. Memories carried in my blood, passed down through generations. The accident. It somehow unlocked them." As if to prove her point, she began writing complex Chinese characters in the margin of her journal, adding detailed notes about architectural features of the ancient temple. Dr. Patel watched in amazement as she drew precise diagrams of building techniques that hadn't been used for centuries. A young nurse, who had recently immigrated from China, confirmed that May was speaking not just modern Mandarin, but also using phrases from classical Chinese that even she barely understood. It was as if Mai had somehow accessed a vast repository of ancient knowledge during her time in the coma. Outside the hospital room, news was already spreading through the building. The quiet Sunday morning had turned into a buzz of activity as medical staff tried to understand what they were witnessing. Dr. Patel knew he should be running tests, checking vitals, following standard protocols for coma recovery, but this was anything but standard. Rita stood by May's bed, tears in her eyes as she watched the young girl she cared for all these months speaking with such certainty and purpose. The morning sun now filled the room completely, and in its light, May looked somehow different. Not just a young patient anymore, but a bridge between past and present, carrying within her memories that stretched back through centuries. As Dr. Patel reached for his phone to make what would be one of the most important calls of his career, he knew that everything was about to change. The medical mystery of room 307 was about to become something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Patel's hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number. It was hardly past 8 a.m. on a Sunday, but he knew this couldn't wait. As the phone rang, he watched through the window of his office as more specialists arrived at the hospital, drawn by the incredible news that was spreading like wildfire through the medical community. "Professor Chen?" "I apologize for calling so early," Dr. Patel said when the call connected. "But there's something you need to see." Professor Chen was one of the world's leading experts in Chinese history and archaeology at the local university. Dr. Patel had reached out to him after seeing his name mentioned in an article about ancient temples. Meanwhile, in May's room, Rita watched in amazement as the young girl continued to write and draw in her journal. Page after page filled with detailed descriptions and sketches, her hand moving with confidence as if she'd been doing this her whole life. "The entrance faces east," May was saying to a breathless group of doctors and nurses. "Behind the waterfall, there's a series of steps carved into the rock. They look natural to anyone who doesn't know what to look for, but they're man-made. They lead to a cave, and inside—" She paused, flipping to a new page in her journal to draw what looked like an intricate door mechanism. Professor Chen arrived within the hour, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked at May's drawings. He pulled out his tablet, comparing her sketches to known archaeological sites. "This is Extraordinary, he whispered. These details, they match fragments of ancient texts we've found, but some of this information was never recorded in any known document. Mai looked up at him and smiled. Because it wasn't meant to be written down, she said in perfect Mandarin. It was passed down through the blood, through the generations. My ancestors were the keepers of these secrets. The professor nearly dropped his tablet. He began asking her detailed questions about ancient Chinese history, things that even most scholars wouldn't know. Mai answered each one without hesitation, sometimes correcting the professor's own understanding of historical events. Dr. Patel sat in a corner of the room, recording everything. His medical training told him this was impossible. A young girl who had never studied Chinese history or language shouldn't be able to speak about ancient dynasties as if she had lived through them. But here she was, doing exactly that. The temple holds more than just scrolls, May explained, her voice taking on a tone of urgency. It contains knowledge that was hidden away during the burning of books in the Qin dynasty. Knowledge that could change how we understand human history. As the morning turned to afternoon, more experts arrived at the hospital. Historians, linguists, and scientists all gathered around May's bed, listening in amazement as she spoke about things that had been lost to time. Rita stayed close by, protective of her young patient despite all the attention. One of the historians pulled Dr. Patel aside. "We need to organize an expedition," he said excitedly. "These coordinates she's given us. They point to an unexplored region in Hunan province. If what she's saying is true." Dr. Patel held up his hand. "She's still my patient," he said firmly. "She just woke up from a 3-month coma. Whatever happens next needs to wait until we're sure she's physically ready." But May had overheard them. "Time is important," she said, switching back to English. "The knowledge has waited for centuries, but now is when it needs to be found. I can feel it." She looked at Dr. Patel with those same wise eyes that had startled him earlier. "Don't worry about me. This is why I woke up. This is why I remembered." Outside the hospital window, the sun was beginning to set on one of the most remarkable days in medical history. But for everyone in that room, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and they were all part of it. 2 months had passed since May's incredible awakening, and now she stood at the base of a mountain in Hunan province, her eyes fixed on the twin peaks that looked exactly like dragon horns. The morning mist swirled around her feet as she pointed confidently toward a barely visible path. "This way," she said, both in English and Mandarin, for the benefit of the mixed team of researchers and explorers who had joined the expedition. Dr. Patel stood close by, still acting as her primary physician, while Rita had taken leave from the hospital to accompany them. She simply couldn't bear to let Mai face this journey alone. Professor Chen consulted his maps, shaking his head in amazement. The location was exactly where Mai had said it would be, yet it had remained hidden from researchers for centuries. The team had spent weeks getting necessary permissions and assembling the right experts for this expedition. "The waterfall should be just ahead," May said, walking with surprising strength for someone who had been in a coma not long ago. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached, and soon they could see the magnificent cascade of water May had described so perfectly in her drawings. The team of geologists examined the rock face behind the waterfall, using special equipment to scan for hidden structures. "She's right," one of them called out excitedly. "There are definitely man-made modifications here. These aren't natural formations." Using advanced climbing gear, they made their way behind the waterfall, where Mai pointed out the ancient steps she had drawn in her journal months ago. They were weathered and almost invisible to the untrained eye, but they were exactly where she said they would be. "Be careful here," May warned as they climbed. "The 5th step is loose. It has been for centuries." The team members looked at each other in amazement as they carefully avoided the 5th step, which indeed turned out to be unstable. After an hour of careful climbing, they reached the cave entrance. Mai walked forward confidently, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls. "Look," she said, pointing to faint markings that matched the symbols in her journal. "These tell the story of why this place was hidden." Professor Chen photographed everything, his hands shaking with excitement as he translated the ancient text. "This is incredible," he breathed. "These are writing styles that we've only seen in fragments before. This is going to rewrite our understanding of ancient Chinese literature." The team moved deeper into the cave system, following May's lead. She walked as if she had been here 1,000 times, confidently navigating the twisting passages. Finally, they reached what appeared to be a solid wall. "The door is here," May said, running her hands over the smooth stone. "Watch." Her fingers found invisible grooves in the rock, pressing them in a specific sequence she had drawn in her journal months ago. With a grinding sound that echoed through the cave, the wall began to move. The beam of their flashlights revealed a chamber that had remained sealed for centuries. The air was surprisingly fresh, thanks to an ancient ventilation system that still worked after all this time. Along the walls were shelves carved into the rock, filled with scrolls and artifacts, perfectly preserved in the controlled environment. Dr. Patel watched as tears rolled down Professor Chen's cheeks. "Many of these texts," the professor whispered, "we thought they were lost forever. The knowledge here, it's beyond priceless." Rita held May's hand as they walked through the chamber. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, still protective of her young charge. May nodded, smiling up at her. "I'm more than okay," she said. "I'm home, in a way. My ancestors protected this place, and now it's time for the world to learn what they protected." As the team began the careful process of documenting everything in the chamber, May sat on a stone bench, looking at an ancient mural on the wall. Dr. Patel sat beside her, still amazed by everything that had happened. "You know," May said quietly, "this is just the beginning. There's so much more to remember, so much more to understand." She touched the old pendant around her neck, the one found among her foster parents' belongings, and smiled. "Sometimes the biggest mysteries are carried in our own blood, just waiting to be awakened." Back at the research facility set up near the temple site, teams of scientists worked around the clock, studying May's brain scans. The mystery of how she had accessed these ancient memories had caught the attention of researchers worldwide, and the small facility had become the center of groundbreaking discoveries. Dr. Patel stood in front of a wall of monitors, each showing different aspects of May's brain activity. "Look at this area here," he said, pointing to a previously dormant region that now showed intense activity. It's as if her brain created new pathways during the coma, connecting to memories that were always there, just waiting to be accessed. In the next room, May sat with a group of genetics researchers who had made an astonishing discovery. "Your DNA shows markers we've never seen before," one of the scientists explained gently. "It's almost like your genes contain a built-in storage system, passing down memories through generations." Rita watched from nearby, still protective of her young friend. She had seen May grow stronger each day, not just physically, but in her understanding of who she was and what she carried within her. The quiet girl from room 307 had become a bridge between past and present. "Tell us about the headaches," a neurologist asked Mai, referring to the brief pain she experienced whenever new memories surfaced. May closed her eyes, thinking carefully before answering. "It's like opening a door that's been closed for a very long time," she explained. "At first, it hurts a little, but then everything becomes clear. Yesterday, I remember how my ancestors used to prepare medicines using plants that modern science hasn't even discovered yet." Professor Chen rushed into the room, holding a newly translated scroll from the temple. "May was right again," he announced excitedly. "These texts describe exactly what she told us about genetic memory. They knew. They understood how to preserve memories in their bloodline, passing down knowledge that was too important to risk writing down. The implications were staggering. If humans could indeed store and pass down memories through their DNA, It would change everything scientists thought they knew about inheritance and consciousness. May's case wasn't just a medical mystery anymore. It was revolutionizing multiple fields of science. But what about her parents? Rita asked quietly during a break. It was a question that had been bothering her since the beginning. May, who had been drawing in her journal, looked up with a small smile. "I remember them now, too," she said softly. "They were protecting me. They knew what I carried in my blood, and they knew others would try to use it before I was ready. They didn't disappear. They went into hiding, waiting for the right time." Dr. Patel sat down beside them, his face showing both excitement and concern. "The latest brain scans show more active regions," he said. "It's as if your mind is still unlocking new areas, accessing more memories." May nodded. "There's still so much to remember," she said. "The temple was just the beginning. There are other places, other knowledge waiting to be found. But this time, we need to be careful about how we share it with the world." Outside the facility, the sun was setting behind the Dragonhorn peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. News crews had been kept at a distance, but their cameras caught glimpses of the teams of researchers coming and going, all drawn by the extraordinary case of a young girl who had awakened from a coma with the memories of centuries. As evening fell, May stood at the window, looking out at the mountains that had held her ancestors' secrets for so long. Rita joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. May shook her head. "No," she replied, touching the ancient pendant around her neck. "For the first time, I understand who I am and why I'm here. The memories I carry aren't just about the past. They're about helping build a better future." 1 year had passed since May first opened her eyes in room 307. The small hospital room where it all began had been transformed into a special research unit, now named the Awakening Center. Dr. Patel stood at its entrance, watching as families brought their children from around the world, hoping to understand their own mysterious connections to the past. Inside his new office, decorated with photos of the temple discovery and May's original drawings, Dr. Patel reviewed the latest findings. The genetic memory research had exploded over the past year, leading to breakthroughs nobody could have imagined. But more incredible than the scientific discoveries was the change he'd seen in his young patient. May was no longer just the quiet girl in the hospital bed. She had become a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science, spending her mornings in regular school classes and her afternoons working with researchers. She had insisted on maintaining as normal a life as possible, despite her extraordinary circumstances. "The memories are clearer now," May explained to a group of visiting scientists. She sat in a comfortable chair in the research center's main room, Rita never far from her side. "They don't come with headaches anymore. It's more like opening a book. I can choose which memories to access and when." The ancient temple had become a carefully protected UNESCO World Heritage Site, with researchers from around the world working together to understand its secrets. The scrolls found inside had already led to discoveries in medicine, astronomy, and human history that were changing textbooks worldwide. But perhaps the most touching development had come 3 months ago, when May suddenly sat up during dinner at her new home with Rita, who had become her legal guardian. "I know where they are," she had said, tears in her eyes. "I remember where my parents went." The reunion had been private, away from the cameras and researchers. May's parents had indeed been protecting her, waiting until she was ready to handle the knowledge she carried. They had been living quietly in a small mountain village, watching from afar as their daughter fulfilled the destiny they had always known she would face. Now, they were part of the research team, helping to understand the genetic heritage that had been passed down through their family line. "We always knew you were special," her mother had said during their reunion. "We just had to wait until you were ready to understand how special." Dr. Patel had established the Global Genetic Memory Research Foundation, dedicated to understanding and helping others who might carry similar genetic memories. May was its youngest board member, insisting that any discoveries should be used to help people, not for profit or power. The Ancient Ones knew this day would come, May said during the Foundation's opening ceremony. They knew that someday the world would need to remember what they knew. That's why they found a way to pass down their memories through blood and bone, waiting for the right time to be awakened. Rita, who had gone back to nursing but remained May's guardian, watched proudly as her former patient became a teacher in her own right. The small succulent plant that had sat on May's windowsill during her coma now had offspring all over the research center, a reminder of how much growth could come from patient care and attention. As the sun set on another busy day at the center, Mai sat in the hospital garden where she often went to think. The evening air was cool, and the sound of birds settling down for the night filled the air. Dr. Patel joined her, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, a tradition they had started during her early recovery days. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" he asked, handing her a cup. "That you had just woken up normally from the coma." May smiled, watching the steam rise from her cup. "Everything happened exactly as it needed to," she said softly. "The accident, the coma, the awakening. It was all part of something bigger than us. The memories I carry aren't just about the past. They're about building a bridge to the future. And that journey is just beginning." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars her ancestors had gazed upon centuries ago. In May's journal, open on her lap, new drawings were taking shape. Different temples, different mysteries, different memories waiting to be discovered. The story that had begun in room 307 was far from over.